everyone. My name is Jennifer Lavasser. I'm a curator here in the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum, and I want to welcome all of you to What's New in Aerospace. And I want to send a quick thank you to our sponsors, Boeing. Today we have a really great talk. I'm hoping all of you are as excited as I am. As somebody who watches a lot of things on television about space, Jeffrey Kluger is a familiar face to me, certainly. He is the editor-at-large for Time magazine, and he's also a local. He grew up in Baltimore and went to the University of Maryland. He's also the author of multiple books on topics from everything from narcissism to polio to siblings. But notably for today, at least in the context of this museum, he is the author of two books that we'll bring up, I think, over the course of this time. First, Lost Moon, which he published in 1994 with Jim Lovell, which is the story of Apollo 13. Of course, was the inspiration for that movie. And today, he'll be not only talking about his new book, but also signing the book afterwards just outside the gallery if you're so interested. The book is Apollo 8, the thrilling story of the first mission to the moon. And please join me in welcoming Jeffrey Kluger.
Thank you.
So I mentioned the book Lost Moon. You wrote it in 1994. It's been some time. You do write about space in Time magazine quite a bit. But what brought you back to that storyline, that exciting moment at this point in time?
The Apollo 13 or Apollo 8?
The Apollo 8 book, sorry.
The Apollo 8 book. A lot of it came from someone who's in the audience today, Jill Santopolo, my young adult book editor, who has a great adult book of her own out. She and I were having lunch one day speaking about great yarns that could work for kids and work for adults. And the story of Apollo 8 came up. And my feeling had always been, and has always been, that when the great tale of American history, American space history is written, it will be Apollos 8, 11, and 13 that are the true benchmark missions. We all know why 11, first footprints on the moon. Apollo 13 was the great tale of survival. But Apollo 8 was the first time human beings left the gravity field of Earth. We have lived for our entire existence as a species at the bottom of a gravity well of Earth. We managed to haul ourselves out of the dirt, get aircraft into the atmosphere, spacecraft around the Earth, but orbiting the Earth is sort of dog paddling in the local harbor. For Apollo 8, it was the first time we sailed across the true deep waters of deep space, went to another world, and for the 24 hours those guys were there, they were creatures of another world. They were no longer Earthlings. They were moon men for 24 hours. It was the mission that made all of the landings possible.
So that sort of gets at what I wanted to ask about, which is what makes Apollo 8 special. Obviously, for those who were alive at the time, Apollo 11 was quite special because of the first steps on the moon. But Apollo 8 was a really dramatic shift in the plan. So talk a little bit about what made it so special at that particular moment in time in 1968.
Well, there are a lot of things that happened. 1968, as we know, was easily the most blood-soaked year in modern human history. There was a Bobby Kennedy assassination, Martin Luther King assassination, riots in the U.S., riots at the Democratic Convention, the Tet Offensive in Vietnam, the Soviet invasion of Prague, more riots in Mexico City, Paris. The world was bleeding from 1,000 self-inflicted wounds. And then in the summer of 1968, a handful of people at NASA realized there was a way to right the ship of the space program and, as a dividend, sort of redeem the year and redeem the country. Remember, this was 1 year after the Apollo 1 fire. NASA had lost 3 astronauts on a launch pad fire. Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee. The dream of getting to the moon by 1970 seemed completely beyond reach now. The spacecraft had to be built from the bottom up. The Saturn V rocket wasn't working. The lunar module was hopeless. That was nowhere near ready to make a landing. So here we were in the summer of '68, 16 months before President Kennedy's deadline. And the guys at NASA, and they were all men at the time, not including the women from Hidden Figures who did such extraordinary work, they said, we can fix this command module, and we can fix this Saturn V. And if we do this work, and if we do it fast, and if we get our guys trained and catch a couple of breaks, we can be in lunar orbit in 16 weeks and kickstart this program. And they did it.
So you mentioned some of the people who actually made this happen. It's not just about the technology, it's about the people who put all this effort into it. Are they what draw you as a journalist to these stories? I mean, these are really dramatic events. Talk a little bit about some of the people, and obviously you have three main characters in your book.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about those particular people.
Well, these three guys up here, they are left to right, Bill Anders, Jim Lovell, and Frank Borman. I never lose sight of the fact that how privileged I am to call Jim a friend. I've known him, I've known the Lovell family for 25 years now. But all three of these guys, in some ways, represented something special and something particular about why human beings travel in space, and that's Frank Borman, why we travel in space and why we do these ambitious things. They all went into it with different motivations. Lovell simply loves nothing more than being in space. He's never as happy as when he's in space, and he was never as happy in space as when he was doing something totally crazy like being on the first crew to fly to the moon. Bill Anders adores machines. He adores the counterintuitive way a machine like the lunar module worked. He made himself an expert of every little rivet and wire and bolt on a lunar module. Now, in this mission, he didn't get to fly with a LEM, so he then learned the systems of the command module. To him, it was taking a machine and making it do something amazing. Frank Borman is and was a patriot. Frank Borman trained to be a fighter pilot. He went to West Point. He joined the Air Force. He wanted to fight in Korea. To him, this was his country needed him, and he was ready to fight. He was grounded for about a year due to a burst eardrum. His window of opportunity passed to fight in Korea. And when this opportunity to be an astronaut and to fly this improbable mission was presented to him, he knew that this was his chance to fight a very important battle in the Cold War, to go out, to win, and to come home. For him, it was a mission. All three guys knew about the epical nature of the mission. They knew that this was a mission they were flying not just for NASA, not just for America, but for the species at large. They were going to make us, Homo sapiens, a two-world species. They were aware of that, but they all came to it with different personal agendas.
And that's actually brought out really nicely in their mission patch, which was designed by Jim Lovell. Really that sort of encompassing, drawing things together, drawing the Earth and the Moon closer together by actually having people go there. And Lovell and Borman had an interesting connection in the fact that they had already flown together. So this is a unique crew in many respects, but in part because they had flown together before.
That's right. And if you go out into the entry gallery, look at the Gemini 4 spacecraft. That was the exact same model of spacecraft that these two guys, Borman and Lovell, flew in the first time they flew. It is basically two coach seats, and you're wearing inflatable suits, so your shoulders are touching. And the overhead is 3 inches above your head when the hatches were closed. Jim and Frank lived in that spacecraft without ever getting to open the doors for 2 solid weeks in low Earth orbit. Borman described it very glamorously as a fortnight in a men's room. That's how he described it. They joked when they came home that they said, well, I don't know, maybe we'll get married.
They'd spent so much time together.
Spent so much time together. But it was a mission nobody wanted. It was this gritty lunch bucket mission. They did it, they performed it brilliantly, and that crew cohesion was, I think, what made Apollo 8 work so well. They brought in Bill Anders, who was a whip-smart, energetic hotshot in all the right ways, and he just rounded out that crew.
And as you said, he didn't get to command he didn't get to drive the lunar module like he had hoped, but he really ended up playing a really substantial role kind of in where Apollo 8's story has come even today, which is through his photography. He really immersed himself in studying the lunar surface. We even have a photo, probably one of the most famous photos ever taken in human history, which is Earthrise, and I know he's talked about it extensively. And these kinds of things, these stories are covered through lots of academic histories, through biographies of these astronauts, and you can see Earthrise here. So what is your take on this flight that is really new to add another voice to that story? What did you learn that you can convey in a book that's new for readers?
Well, first of all, before I answer that, I want to say this is not by accident that this picture is sideways. Bill Anders, in fact, insists on rotating at 90 degrees because remember, they were flying around the flank of the moon. So the Earth actually rises in a lateral way. Now, the lunar surface was below them, so they saw it right side up, but this is really the way it looks in space. What made this a new experience for me? Look, I knew that it was going to be thrilling to write everything that happened when they got into the spacecraft. And my editor, John Sterling, who happened to be my first editor when I wrote Apollo 13, he said to me, I want those guys in that spacecraft by 40% of the way through your book. If you haven't got them there by then, cut 10%. He's a very smart man. He knows how to pace a book. And I worked very hard to make that happen. But what struck me also was that 16-week window that they had to get this mission out of the planning stage and onto the launch pad. And it was that monomaniacal focus that they showed at NASA, particularly in Houston, to get the systems ready, to sell the necessary NASA brass on the idea of doing this. It was, my original very long subtitle for this book was going to be The Ingenious and Outrageous, Inspired and Insane Nation-Saving Mission of Apollo 8. The marketing crew almost hit me over the head with a rolled up newspaper and said, enjoy that, because it'll never see print. But it did capture the nature of the mission. It was ingenious, and it was inspired, and it was outrageous, and it was insane. And yet, every single person who was brought into the room for these quiet conversations, every higher and higher level of NASA brass who was told, we think we have a way to get to the moon in 16 weeks, they all said, you are out of your mind, it can't be done. And then they listened. And then they said, well, I think it can be done. I think we do have the hardware. We just have to fix it. I think we do have the manpower and woman power and human power to sprint to this mission. We certainly have the astronaut personnel. Look, Borman, Lovell, and Anders were great people for this mission, but as Chris Kraft, the director of flight operations, once told me, I asked him, what is the best pure pilot and the best crew you ever flew? And he said, people always ask me that, and I always say, you're going to think I'm making it up, but my answer was always, it is whatever crew I'm flying right now, because every crew benefits from what the previous crew did. So even if for some reason Borman, Lovell, and Anders hadn't been able to fly, McDivitt, Scott, and Schweikert would have been able to do it, Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins, they had these trios of extraordinarily gifted men. They just had to pick the one they thought was right for this mission.
And we saw an image of the launch there of Apollo 8, and that's what's really, to some degree, really audacious about what they did is they put people on top of a Saturn V, and this was the very first time that had been done, and it didn't just go to orbit, it went all the way to the moon. And there had been previous Saturn V launches that went all right, but not exactly perfect.
Yeah, the first one was perfect. The second one almost shook itself apart getting to orbit. Chris Kraft, again, a very frank man, he went out to give his post-launch press conference on that unmanned flight, and NASA expected him to be very politic about it. He had a two-sentence statement. This was a disaster. Write that down. Disaster. There's no way to fix that, and walked out of the room. And then, 8 months later, they said, all right, we're going to put 3 guys on top. But it was because they had faith in their ability to sort out what the problem was, and they did sort it out.
So we're talking a little bit now about technology, and of course the museum itself is home to a lot of that technology of the Apollo era. Apollo 8 itself is actually housed at the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago, and we have a really interesting picture of its arrival there, which I think everybody will find kind of interesting. But when you see these objects, how does that connect what you've done as far as your research and then what actually happened? You know, you've talked to the people,
right.
Now you're seeing the technology. Talk a little bit about sort of what your reactions are to coming to a place where we've got all that stuff.
Well, that's the thing. I was never quite so happy about my schedule this morning as when Jennifer told me, by the way, you have an hour to kill. I said, all right, well then get the security team and drag me away from the display of the LEM or whatever else it is. I believe these machines in these museums are powerfully, evocatively important for a lot of reasons. First of all, I don't think anyone fully realizes the scale of them until you're standing next to them. In the case of the lunar module, say, it is, that machine, I've always said, is so ugly it's beautiful. It is the perfect machine. I can look at pictures of that all day, and to stand in the vicinity of it and see, this is the scale, this is the tactile nature of it, even though we don't get to touch it. This is what it would have looked like to be a person engaged with that machine. The Apollo-Soyuz mated spacecraft out in the gallery over there are another example of that. You have the sleek Apollo spacecraft. You have the much more irregular looking Soyuz spacecraft. You have two different machines built by two different empires on two different sides of the world. Empires that were at dagger points with each other, nuclear dagger points, and yet between them, connecting them, there's this big lumpy chunk of 7-ton black hardware that served as the docking collar. It had a port for the American ship, it had a port for the Russian ship. It was the greatest engineering metaphor for global geopolitics, for how you can bring two spacecraft together, and in so doing bring two nations together. To see the hardware is to make it tactile, is to make it real. It's the reason I never tire of looking at these great space toys.
Oh, we're happy to have you come anytime to take a visit. But a modern manifestation of what you're talking about right now is actually hanging behind you, which is the International Space Station model. The International Space Station is the size of a football field, and yet many nations came together to build this thing. And of course, Time Magazine's actually chronicled some of this by way of a documentary about one of the more exciting moments of the last few years, especially in going to the space station, which is the Year in Space mission of Scott Kelly and Mikhail Kornienko. And you know, thinking about that kind of those two stories together, Apollo-Soyuz and the International Space Station, these partnerships. How do you see sort of in what you've been doing lately with Time Magazine, some of your articles and research, in this political climate, in this climate of sort of technology sharing or not sharing, and the sort of general public support for spaceflight? Can we expect to see this continue? Can we really think that something like a partnership from the International Space Station is going to go forward, is going to take us to the next place?
This is one of those questions that I actually feel like I can answer optimistically. I think the collaboration will continue, and I think it should continue. Now, part of it is simply because we're invested in it. If 17 nations who have collaborated to build this, if you took 17 families and they all built an apartment building and they all lived together, you're kind of stuck with each other. So you better make this work. You put a lot of effort into it. I also think that will serve as a template for future international collaboration. Getting spacecraft to Mars, getting human beings to Mars, will be an order of magnitude more difficult than it was to get human beings to the moon, just because the distances are so much greater. But if you can bring 17 countries together to do it, you cut costs, you cut time, you build collaboration, you bring special expertise from different groups of people. And also, I was touched by how readily and how poignantly the US-Russian collaboration in space transcends petty politics. You know, when we were over in Baikonur, the Time crew, and we watched the launch of a Soyuz rocket at 1:30 in the morning in the bitter cold steppes of Kazakhstan. First of all, I could have died happy at that point to see a Soyuz rocket take off.
Launches are pretty spectacular.
They're pretty spectacular. And as I was saying to Jennifer earlier, there was such a granular level of collaboration there. There were 3 astronauts or 1 astronaut and 2 cosmonauts climbing into that ship. There was an American flag on the shoulder of one and a Russian flag on the shoulder of the other, all the way down to the little details when they gave press conferences, a miniature American flag, a miniature Russian flag, and when they got to Kazakhstan for the reentry, a miniature Kazakh flag. Everything about it is a symbol. The semiotics are all collaboration, cooperation. Scott Kelly, who of course has a twin brother, Mark Kelly, nothing is a more defining relationship in his life than his relationship with his twin. He nonetheless calls Misha Kornienko my brother from another mother, because they had that year in space together.
Sure. I wanted to sort of bring us back to the Apollo 8 story a little bit, and folks may have seen a photo that popped up there, which is the moon sort of as seen by the Apollo 8 crew. Seeing something like that, seeing Earth from that perspective, is really something obviously that was brand new at this time. This was huge. They broadcast from the moon on Christmas Eve. This is a pivotal moment. This is when people are able to not only see the Earth through photographs later, but see it live on their television from 250,000 miles away. Is that really something that is helpful for us to think about today, as far as how space and the media, the space community and the media kind of interact? I mean, there's this partnership between the two. I mean, NASA's job can't be done without public support. The media brings that story to the public. Talk a little bit about your role as a sort of a writer in sort of the space community, and sort of the excitement maybe that you're helping impart of that story.
Well, that is something that I like to think about. Look, I would love to be an astronaut. I wanted to be an astronaut when I was a little boy. I still want to be an astronaut. I always realized, though, even as a little boy, I am so ill-equipped to be an astronaut. It is just not something that I have the brass to do. But to be in the vicinity of that, to orbit around that, as it were, to be in mission control, to be at Baikonur, to be sitting here. Marilyn Lovell once said to me when we were on the set of the Apollo 13 movie, and again, this is when I was already starting to feel really close to Marilyn and to the family at large. She said something to me that I took exactly the way she meant it. She said, "Look, I've come to believe that Jim was born to fly the mission of Apollo 13, and you were born to tell that story." And I know she wasn't disparaging my other things I've written, but that's okay with me, to think that I was a little boy in Pikesville, Maryland, and my favorite astronaut was Jim Lovell. And the randomness of, human beings are sort of like subatomic particles. We just move around randomly, and then boom, two collide. And if that collision involved my running into Jim Lovell and being able to make people understand why that story was important, and with Apollo 8 being able to make people understand that, that's a good day's work. And I feel both humbled and privileged to be able to do it.
I just want to remind the audience here, if you have a question, feel free to go sit in the back row, where we've got some posted signs for where you can stand. Before I get into, and just want to mention that before I get into my last couple questions. So the crew obviously successfully returned. What happened next? What did they all, I mean, they parted ways, of course, and went off to do other things. In the immediate aftermath, though, where did their lives take them as far as a crew? What was the
Their lives went to very different places. Frank Borman was done when he landed. It wasn't like he didn't have a good time. He did. It wasn't like he didn't realize the epical nature of the mission. He did. But he also knew, this was my Cold War mission. I'm home from the mission. At the end of the book, we have him sort of on the deck of the carrier, and he gives his Apollo spacecraft an affectionate pat and walks off and doesn't look back. He was a man with a patriotic job to do, and he did it. Bill Anders would have loved to have gone back into space, but he also knew that the Byzantine NASA flight rules would have meant that if he ever did get assigned to another mission, the odds were very good that he would have been in the center seat of the Apollo, which would have meant he would have gone out to the moon again and still not gotten to land. The two other people would have landed. So he was offered a position in government as a consultant or as an advisor to then President Nixon, and he then went into private industry, and he was very happy doing that. Jim Lovell, he was halfway to the moon, and he said, "Baby, I'm coming back here." He just knew what he wanted to do. He knew that he had traveled 250,000 miles to get to the moon, and had gotten within 6 miles of the surface. And he was determined to close that last 6 miles. Now, as history proved, as I say in the book, Jim Lovell, who flew on Apollo 8 and learned what happens when a spacecraft does everything right, would later learn what happens when a spacecraft does everything wrong.
So So sort of on a more personal note for me, I was born after Apollo. We obviously have lots of visitors in our audience who don't remember Apollo 8, don't remember Apollo 11 or Apollo 17, the last mission to go to the moon. I grew up watching the space shuttle. Of course, the International Space Station is still flying today, and my children won't even remember space shuttles flying other than seeing Discovery out at our building not too far from here. So what does Apollo 8, thinking about the experiences of those particular astronauts, how is that instructive or helpful for thinking about, maybe a career in space flight or inspiring new generations, basically, to think about, where they can go?
Well, there are a couple of things about that. I will just briefly include an anecdote. When summer 2012, my family went out to visit the Lovels to stay at their home for the weekend. My daughters were then 11 and 9, and Jim was taking us to the Museum of Science and Industry to see the Apollo 8 spacecraft. And on the way over, I pulled my girls aside and said, "Look, ladies, you may be too young to appreciate this right now, but this is Columbus showing you the Santa Maria. Keep that in mind for later." And they did seem to keep that in mind until they got back to the Lovels' house and they saw the Lovels' big shaggy dog, Toby, and then everything was all about Toby again. But for a minute, they had that appreciation. The other thing, and you and I spoke about this earlier, is if you look at the three qualities I was talking about with the three astronauts, Anders, a man of engineering, Lovell, a man of exploration, Borman, a man of patriotic duty. Well, those are three pretty darn good qualities to take into any career if you're, say, a 16, 17, 20-year-old student looking at your future. So you could do worse than follow the example of these three guys in planning your own future.
I think we have a question from the audience.
Good afternoon. I was a college student home for Christmas during the Apollo 8 mission, and I'd love to hear your experience of that Christmas Eve broadcast. I know I wept. It was so beautiful, but how did you experience it? And even more importantly, how did the crew experience it?
Well, I could lie and say, gee, I was way too young to remember it, but that would be a complete untruth. I was plenty old enough to remember it. I was a very young adolescent, and as a young adolescent male, I had already learned one of the rules, which is show no emotion. You're tough. You certainly don't cry over things. Could not abide by that rule. Even as a kid, I felt that frisson of excitement. I felt tears coming into my eyes because I knew that this was something wholly different. And when they read on Christmas Eve, when they read the verses of Genesis, I didn't grow up in a terribly religiously observant family. I knew what Genesis was. You could have been a person of faith, you could have been an atheist. It didn't matter. The verse of Genesis is beautiful. It's a beautiful verse. And what was it speaking of? It was speaking of birth, or in the case of Apollo of 1968, rebirth. It was speaking about a way to save, to redeem this year. That was not lost on me. I was devastated watching Bobby Kennedy's death, Martin Luther King's death. I lived in Baltimore. Baltimore burned in the riots that followed the deaths. I knew how dreadful, how mortal that year had been. I think it was the ability to redeem the year, and I believe that the astronauts themselves appreciated that, but not until they came back. Of all of the telegrams, all of the letters, all of the awards they got from leaders around the world, all three of them say that what impressed them and touched them most was a simple card from someone who her identity still remains unknown. It was a female, a woman, who wrote them a card and simply said to the crew of Apollo 8, "Thank you for saving 1968." And I think they felt that that was what they did. So, you know, they all went back to the rest of their work, to the work that consumed them afterwards, but they knew what they had done for the world. And I think that's a pretty darn good legacy.
I think there was an element of surprise there, too, to hear religious text coming from a mission, because already we were thinking of NASA and spaceflight as being all about science and technology.
Yeah.
And the fact that they literally were at another world and they were out in the cosmos, I don't think anyone expected them to convey that particular message.
Right, and if you remember the famous activist atheist Madeleine Murray O'Hair back then, she actually filed a suit or threatened to file a suit because this was basically mixing church and state. It was a government enterprise and they had read scripture, and the whole world basically said, fight a different fight. Please don't fight this fight. And when Frank Borman spoke, they all addressed Congress, and when he addressed in his talk, the Supreme Court was sitting right down in front, and he said, and I was very happy to be able to read the verses of Genesis. Just a few years, the Supreme Court had ruled that prayer could not be in public schools, and he said, but now seeing the 9 gentlemen in the front row, I'm wondering if we maybe shouldn't have done that. And everyone laughed, because everyone knew, abiding strictly by separation of church and state, of course, that technically broke the rules. But it broke the rules for such a grander good. So I don't think reasonable people objected.
Thank you for your comments.
Thank you.
Well, I want to thank all of you for joining us today, and join me in thanking Jeffrey Kluger for joining us. And of course, if any of you are inclined and interested, he'll be signing books just outside this gallery. And thank you for joining us for What's New in Aerospace, sponsored by Boeing, and have a good afternoon.